Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
I was determined that I wanted to be a painter, and I thought I would be a portrait painter because that was the only kind of painter I knew could make a living. But shortly after I entered art school, I realized that there was much more possible, and I wasn't going to just stick to such a narrow format. But I was really convinced that making drawings and paintings from the human figure was a noble enterprise and something that really mattered to me. I felt really comfortable and really it was an appropriate thing for me to do. So with that as a basis, that was the beginning of an idea of how to become an artist. And I was now in a place that in Baltimore when I moved down there for my first year of art school. I was in a really rough town, my first impressions of Baltimore were, it reminded me of Atlantic City in the wintertime. It was kind of a harsh place and not very many people on the street. And it seemed like the city was built for something else that had not happened or wasn't happening anymore. Anyway, I had this apartment that was about 4 blocks away from the school in a pretty dark neighborhood. When I say dark, there were a lot of empty buildings, boarded up, was mostly African-American rental units. There was a high presence of rodents and signs for rat baiting all over so that you had to be careful not to get poisoned. And late at night, every night, somebody would come and knock on the front window, and I would go to the window, and it was a guy who had things to sell, and I always found that pretty interesting. Coming from a small suburban town, I was not familiar with that. But anyway, most of the time he had stuff he wanted to sell for a couple of dollars, and I didn't want it. But one particular day he had this big box of paper. And he wanted to sell it, and I said, well, let me look at the paper. So I looked at the paper, and it was all this colored paper, and it had this funny texture to it, like a phlox feeling or a velvety feel. And I said, well, how much is the paper? And we agreed that I could buy the whole box, which must have had 250 sheets in it, for $8, and I bought the box. And now I had the paper, and I had to figure out what to do with it. And I kept trying to use it, and you couldn't draw on it with a normal material. It didn't work very well. And so every day in my free time, I would try to do something different with this paper. And then eventually, I hit on a way of using oil pastels on the paper that worked really pretty well. And I did a self-portrait looking in the mirror and made this self-portrait head with these oil pastels. And I liked it a lot, and I put it on the wall, and my roommates all liked it. And so I started making drawings of all the people in the building, all the roommates, all the other art students who lived in the building. And then I had this horribly ugly wallpaper in my bedroom these big yellow and orange flowers, very 70s kind of design look. And I hated that paper, wallpaper. So I began to make drawings on these sheets of 22 by 30-inch floxed paper, which I now know is called Swiss micro cover velour paper. And as I would make these drawings, the color of the paper would affect the way I would look at the image and the color that I would choose to make the drawings. So now students in the college were coming by and asking me to make drawings of them. So I started making all these drawings and I started pinning them on the wall. I started at the baseboard and I went all the way up to the ceiling and I started moving right across the wall. So where there once had been all these flowers, when you walked into the room, it was like a rogues gallery of all the students at the school. And I determined to draw everything exactly the way they came to me. So if they came wearing a black leather jacket, I had to figure out how to draw the black leather jacket. If they had a woolly sweater, I had to make a woolly sweater. If they had a hat, I had to include the hat. If they had sunglasses or regular glasses, everything had to be included. So they had a real particularity to them. And they were all oversized. The heads were much larger than life size because I really didn't want to draw a lot of other extraneous stuff. I really wanted to make them about the heads, the portraits. So anyway, I'm covering the walls with these things and going to school and doing my regular schoolwork. And I don't know, I guess after about a month or so, 2 months into this, one night, the head of the drawing department from the school, Abby Sangiamo, who was one of Joseph Alber's cronies and handpicked students, was in my apartment looking at another student's work for some project he was working on. And he walked past this wall and he stopped dead in his tracks and he looked at the wall and he turned around and he said to the other people, he said, "Who did this?" And they all looked kind of like, was he upset? Was he mad? Nobody could figure out. He said, "Who did this?" And so they pointed at me, and he turns and he looks at me and he said, "You?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You're in my class, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You didn't do these in my class." I said, "No, I do what you tell me to do in your class. This is something I'm doing for myself." He said, well, tell me what it is you're doing. And I tried to explain it. He said, "I want you to draw me right now." So I sat down and I made a drawing of him. And he looked at it. And then he said, "Come with me." And he took me in his car and we went someplace. And he took me in and he said, "I want you to draw this guy." And I sat down and drew that guy. And he looked at the drawing and then he took me home. And then every time I was at school, he would always come over and want to talk to me. And we became kind of really close. And, I enjoyed having his attention. And then he would bring periodically, he'd say, "Come with me." And then he'd say, "I want you to draw this person," or something like that. So anyway, that went on. And then one day he said to me, he said, "Look, I've arranged for you to have a show." And I said, "A show?" He said, "Yeah, your drawings. I want you to have a show of your drawings." And I said, "I don't even, I've never had a show." And he said, "Well, you're going to take a number of your drawings." He said, "If you want, I'll help you. We'll pick them out together." And he said, "And then you get some pictures, frames, and you put them in frames. And there's a theater on North Avenue where they show European films." And he said, "They have a gallery in the front of the theater." And he said, "You'll hang your paintings, your drawings there." So I walked over and looked at the theater, and they showed me where it was. I counted off. There was room for 20 drawings. So I asked my father to put together 20 picture frames, and he made the picture frames, and I got glass from a hardware store, and I put glass in them all, and we framed them up, and I took my drawings down, and I hung them up in this theater. And they opened the movie with my show, was a Bernardo Bertolucci film called The Conformist. It was my very first show, and it was all these portraits of the students that I knew from the art school. And then every time I would go by the theater, the guy the manager would always hand me a piece of paper because I didn't have a phone. And he said, this person wants you to call them up because they want you to draw them. So after a while, my show was up for about 2 months, and I would get these phone numbers on a regular basis. So I'd call these numbers, and I'd get $20 or $30 or $40 for making a drawing of somebody. And it was my first real exhibition experience and art experience. Anyway, making those drawings really gave me a sense of identity. They also, had an impact on my personality in the school. I suddenly was somebody that people recognized. One of the things about being in an art school is you really don't want to fit in. You want to stand out. You want to be known for something that you do that no one else does. And I felt in art school for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who looked at the world the way I did, saw different things than me, but I sort of understood exactly how they saw, and I was very intrigued by all of that. And now I had this way of making these drawings that really paid a lot of attention to the way I saw, and other people were enjoying them. Well, 25 years later, I got a letter from Abby Sangiamo. And it was really one of the most touching things. He wrote me a letter telling me that he had such a fond memory of me as a student, and that I had influenced him and his work through my drawings. And I found it hard to believe, number one, that I had done such a thing, and number two, that he could even say that I had been an influence to him. And anyway, the line that he used, he said, who is this skinny kid who is drawing on colored paper? And he said, nobody drew on colored paper. Everybody drew on white or buff. That was the Yale approach to drawing, and everybody subscribed to it. And he said, and there you are drawing on red paper, on green paper, on black paper, on blue paper. And he said, and then I thought about it, and I realized that in the history of art, artists drew on colored paper all the time, and that we just had forgotten something. So he said, for me, you became kind of like a voice from the past, reminding me that something had been lost, that something good had been forgotten. And he said, and I began to incorporate it into my own work. And he was inviting me to Baltimore to see a show of his work, which was going to be pretty much one of his last shows in the art school. And I drove down to see his show, and I saw what he was talking about, because there was the installation, which was very similar to the installation I had made in my kitchen all those years earlier. In my bedroom all those years earlier. And there they were. That wallpaper was covered, and here he had covered these walls with these portraits of students and of models and of people, and they did have a lot of connection to those drawings that I had made early on. I thought his were much more sophisticated than mine were from the time. His were he had gone to art school and had the touch of an artist. They looked like art drawings, and mine were not, in my opinion, were far less skillful. I was much less trained and accomplished. But anyway, it was still a nice compliment, and it echoed something which I had been learning all along, which is you don't learn how to be an artist by being told what to do. You learn how to be an artist by having your experiences and doing the things that occur to you as they occur in front of you and around you, with the things that you have in your hands and in your mind and your eye. It's not something you can train into someone. It's something that you can encourage out of someone. So as I myself went on to be a teacher, I wanted to be far much more interested in encouraging people to find their own voice rather than to do a thing in a particular way or do it the way they were told to do it. And I set that as a kind of as a rule that I would try not to tell people how to do things, but try to create situations where students or somebody who wanted to be an artist could discover what they could do and how they could do it. And so that experience, really helped to shape my idea of how art had to be taught and how an artist can find their way and find their own voice. And as I said, I really have let that be a lesson that I keep following. So when I walk by something and I see it for the first time, and if it attracts my attention, I move in close and try to figure out what's going on there and how can I get involved in doing that if it appeals to me, and take that as a starting point. So in that process of learning how to see, I was learning also what I think I could help others, another way that others could learn to see. So in that same process, in that same year when I was making those drawings, I was aware of the fact that in the basics classes that I was doing as an art student, the subject matter was, far less interesting to me than the thing that I really liked to do, which was to draw and paint from the figure. And I saw a sign that there was, when school was going to be closing for December and January for the winter break, that there was going to be a figure painting class with James Hennessy, who was the chairman of the painting at the school. I didn't really know anything about Jim Hennessy at the time. All I knew is that all the students in this big art school filled with really talented people all seemed to think he was very special and he had done something very significant, even though I had no idea what it was. And so I went up to the sign-up day and I tried to sign up for the class, and they said, you can't. You're not eligible. It's only for juniors and seniors. So I said, well, I want to take the class. And they said, well, you can't, and you can go talk to the teacher, but you can't get in there. So I went to see him, and I'd never met him, and I told him what I wanted to do. And he looked at me and he said, look, he said, bring me some of your paintings and I'll look at them. If your paintings are okay, I'll think about it. So I went home and I got my paintings and I came right back, and I was standing outside of his office and I said, I'm here. He looked at my paintings and he scratched his beard and he said, okay, you can take the class. So I signed up. Everybody went home for Christmas and I stayed in Baltimore. And I went down for my first day of class. And we got it in, he introduced the class, told us what the problem was going to be. Everybody had their canvas. I had carried my 3 by 5 foot canvas, the 5 blocks to the school, and carried my paint and all of my painting material with me, up 3 flights of stairs to the top floor to this big old room in this former Baltimore and Ohio Station building. Drafty windows and all, and I set up my stuff in front of on an easel, and the teacher came into the room and looked around. There was about 10 or 12 students in the room, and he gave us our marching orders, basically told us what we were going to do, and essentially what he said was, well, the model's going to pose and your job is to figure out how to paint it. But he said, I'll tell you right now, if I had Rembrandt and if I had Picasso and I had Matisse and I had Rubens all in this painting room, I'd walk around and I'd look at their painting, I'd look at that model, and I would see something in that model that would be in those paintings, but no two of those paintings would look like each other. And he said, that's the problem. That's what we have to do. The model will pose for 5 days. You get to figure out what you have to do. So that actually even fit into this little structure that I was building in my mind about how you learn. And I set about painting. And so as the class would progress, Jim would scratch his beard, puff on his Pall-Malls. He smoked 4 packs of Pall-Malls in a class. I never saw anybody smoke so much in my life. But one of the things in art school was that everybody smoked in art school, because you were always supposed to make something happen in your painting, then you'd step back and look at it, and then you'd smoke, and you'd think about what you had done, then you'd get close and paint some more, and then step back, smoke again. So there was a lot of smoking going on. So anyway, Jim would walk around the room and he would talk to the different people, and there was always, he would tell stories and things about artists, famous artists, or stories about contemporary artists that he knew, etc. And he would stand behind me, and he never said anything to me. He would just scratch his beard, puff on his cigarettes, and then move on. And I remember him standing off to the right of me a lot. And I was nervous because I figured he was probably watching me more than anybody else, seeing that I was the youngest person in the room and the least experienced person. And everywhere I looked, everybody looked like they knew what they were doing, and nobody was doing the same thing. So I couldn't say, oh, I'm going to do that. I had to figure out what I was going to do. So I'm painting. He'd stand behind me 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 days. Not a word came out of his mouth. So finally, he's standing behind me on this 4th day. And as he's standing there, and I could feel he was about to move on, I said, could I ask you a question? And Jim said, sure. So I said, I've been painting on this arm and hand. And I said, I've tried this, I tried that, and I just can't get it to feel right. And I keep trying. I said, could you give me some clue, something I'm missing, something I should look for? So he got close to my painting. He looked at my painting carefully, took his hand and scratched densely into his beard. And then the smoke cloud just billowed up all around him as he puffed away. And finally he says to me, he said, hands and feet are hard as shit to paint. And as he said that, he sort of looked at me and made it clear he was done. And I looked at my painting and I felt like something had magically happened. We had crossed over, and now I was really in that room. I was getting the same kind of wisdom that everyone else was getting. And that story filled me with energy, because what he had done was brought me in. I felt like I was a member of that class. So anyway, I never forgot it. And years later, 30-some years later, I was visiting Jim Hennessy in his home. He had since retired. And I was visiting him in Baltimore. By the way, he had stopped smoking in 1980 when they had to remove one of his lungs for cancer. But anyway, he was still painting, still lively. I visited him, and we're sitting in his living room and drinking a bottle of wine, and we're talking. And he was telling the story of how he had studied with Diebenkorn. Now, what I had now known, that I didn't know way back when I first took his class, was that, yes, he had been one of Diebenkorn's star students at the University of Colorado, and that after studying with Diebenkorn, he had been selected to be included in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There were 150 artists who had been selected from all across the United States in a show called Figure Painting in the USA, which John Cannaday in the New York Times called the most important show at the Museum of Modern Art in 15 years. And Jim Hennessy was singled out in the New York Times as the best painter in that show. Jim Hennessy went on to win 2 Prix de Rome prizes and spent a couple of years painting in Rome. And here I am sitting in his living room, and he's telling me this story of studying with the great Diebenkorn. And as he tells the story, he goes on, he says, I was so touched. Diebenkorn, such a great painter. I'm going to be working with such a master. And he said, so I'm in his class, and he said, I'm painting, And the guy would walk by and he'd look at my painting and he didn't say anything. Day 1 goes by, day 2 goes by, day 3 goes by. And I'm listening to this story and I'm thinking, this story sounds awfully familiar to me. So anyway, as he keeps going, he said, so we get down to the 4th day and he said, I'm walking around and I'm talking to other people and I'm saying, that Diebenkorn guy, he's not such a hot guy. He's not as good as everybody says. He doesn't even, he says, I'm bad-mouthing him because I'm upset that he isn't talking to me. So he said, I'm out there in the college green and I hear my name being called out. And he said, I turn and I look, and there's Diebenkorn signaling me. And he said, Jim, come over. And he says, I go over and I sit down. And he said, Jim, let's talk about your painting. And he said, as he started talking, he said, I felt so bad because I realized he knew more about my painting than I did. And here he wanted to talk about it in detail. So he said, I felt kind of bad. But he said, it was a good experience. And so as he's telling that story, I said, Jim, I have a very similar story with you. And I recalled in brief form how that had occurred with him in his class all those years before for me. With that, he gets up and he goes across and he pulls open a drawing drawer, goes through the drawer, and he comes out with a drawing of that model from that class all those years before. And here, when he was standing off to the right of me, he was working on a drawing of that model. And so he showed me the drawing, and then he told me that he would like to trade that drawing with me for one of those drawings, those heads that I had made back in those days when I was making those head drawings that he had seen. And we agreed. So the last time I was in his house, there hanging on the living room wall was the drawing that I had made one night when Abby Sanjama had taken me out to draw a guy in the library in Baltimore. And I have the drawing that Jim had made from that model, that first figure painting that we made side by side. And the point of my story is that there seems to be a thing that just seems to go through time, that artists learn from one another and they share experiences and discover through the process of making art the way that the world really looks to them. And so if there's one thing that I've learned, it is that you just start by doing. And as you do it, you bring in all the references and all the ideas that are around you. But in the end, you're sort of on your own. And the way you can be a member of any art group or any experience is by doing and trying to find your own way of saying or doing something.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.